when the sky is high. No reason to stay around. Pick your hands and you can touch and fly.
Hello and welcome to the Aviatrix book review. I'm Liz Booker. My guest today is a pilot, writer, and photographer who edits an aviation magazine called Air Sport for the Australian Sport Aircraft Association. Her first book, Australian Women Pilots, Amazing True Stories of Women in the Air, the Aviatrix Book Club discussion book for April 2021, is a compilation of 10 stories ranging from the first Australian woman to operate with her commercial pilot license through current day aviation women pioneers. You can find her at her website, kathymexted.com. Kathy Mexted, welcome.
Thanks, Liz.
I'm so excited to talk to you about all these incredible women who you have written so beautifully about in your book and all of their adventures. But before we start, I would love for you to do a reading for anyone who might not have read the book yet.
Okay, no worries. So I'll start at the beginning, which is always a good place to start, isn't it? There's a song about that.
Yeah.
Start at the very beginning. So this is my book, Australian Women Pilots, and it's 10 stories of Australian women. And the first one starts in the 1930s with Nancy Bird Walton. And so Nancy was the first woman to use her commercial license in Australia. And she was 19 and she went off into the outback and flew the nursing sister on her rounds from Burke, which is an outback town, 120 miles in a loop out to check on the children. She was the mothercraft nurse, basically. But before all that, Nancy had to learn to fly, and she was only 13 when she left school, and she worked for her father up at his general store up in the country. Her mum was in Sydney with 5 children. And Nancy was convinced she was going to learn to fly. And so Kingsford Smith, who our main Sydney airport is named after, he flew into a town near where Nancy was living, and she went across and had a joy flight. And it was her second flight, but by the time he returned, she was determined to learn to fly. So this is young Nancy at about 15 or 16 years old, meeting the man who would convince her to go to Sydney and get her license. So Kingsford Smith, for the American readers who don't know, flew across the Pacific Ocean from the US to Australia in his aeroplane with 3 other guys, just navigating to vital pinpoint locations. And it was quite a remarkable feat. So he was like the national hero. So 300,000 people turned up at Sydney Airport to meet Kingsford Smith when he arrived back. Wow. So for Nancy to meet this man in person was quite a big thing. So Sir Charles Edward Kingsford Smith, MC, AFC, lived from 1897 to 1935. He was often called Smithy, and he was the most famous man in Australia at the time, revered for his wartime prowess and his record-breaking flights, most notably crossing the Pacific Ocean with his co-pilot and business partner. Having landed in Brisbane, 300,000 people turned out in Sydney to greet them when they arrived there. Now, 5 years later, and several records later, Smithy had parted ways with his business partner and was setting up his own aviation business in Sydney. It would include flight training and maintenance. Determined by nature and convinced that she would learn to fly in the intervening 3 years since Nancy had met them last time, Nancy had purchased a leather flying jacket, a helmet, and some goggles. So she'd got that out of her £1 a week wage working in her father's general store, this young teenage girl. Barnstorming at Wingham, Smithy's team watched her approach across the field in this get-up and wondered where on earth she'd come from. The stars aligned, though, when, with all the assurance of youth, Nancy informed Smithy of her intention to learn to fly. Of course, he invited her to his new flying school because he was polite and she was sweet and students bring money and Smithy needed it. He probably assumed she wouldn't show. But when the famous Charles Kingsford Smith invites you to learn to fly with him, It would be a great lost opportunity not to appear. Nancy had already decided that she would become a pilot, and so the timing was right. 9 weeks later, as her 17th birthday approached, Nancy was ready to go and informed her father accordingly. Whether from fear or frustration, her father exploded in a fit of emotion. It did nothing to slow down his daughter. In her 3.5 years working for him in the store, Nancy had almost saved the £200 required for a pilot's licence. Much of it was from her £1 weekly wage, and it was topped up with an insurance policy her father had taken out, which matured when she turned 16. She went home to her mother in Sydney, and for each week, each flying lesson undertook the lengthy trip from Manly on the northern beaches to the airfield at Mascot, which is on the other side of the harbour. This involved a train, a ferry, and ultimately a long walk. Smithy took Nancy for her first 1 or 2 flying lessons, and while he was a brilliant pilot, his time was better spent building the business and pursuing more record-breaking adventures. And that was that. So that was how she got going. Yeah. And it took a lot of, I think what I love about that part of the story is just her determination, this young kid, to go and get all the gear. And
she came all kitted out, ready to go, I'm ready to fly. Sign me up.
And they're watching her across the field like, who's this? That was in 1930, I think that happened, 29 or something like that. Yeah.
That's so great. That is so great. That's when the first women's race was in the United States. So that's incredible.
Okay.
Yeah. 17. So you're a pilot. You share with us in your introduction a little bit about that. And I just love the story of the first call that we had. We had just this sort of impromptu call. We were chatting on Messenger, and you said, do you have time for a call? I'm like, sure, why not? I'm sitting here all smug in my bedroom where I normally work, looking out at my backyard with my pool. And trust me, I have lived in many accommodations over the course of 28 years of military service. So it's a treat to be able to live in an environment that I am just very comfortable in, and I have a nice view. And you're there, it's late afternoon here, and you're there, it's early morning for you, and you're getting out of bed, and you walk outside, and I'm like, oh, that's nice. She has a patio off of her bedroom door. Isn't that lovely? And because the camera's facing you, and then somewhere in the conversation, you say, would you like to see my hangar? And I'm like, you're what? And then you turn the camera around. You turn the camera around and you walk across this field and show me your landing strip and your hangar, and this gorgeous piece of property. How on earth did you come to live on a piece of land with your own hangar, your own plane, your own landing strip? Tell me that.
You're making it sound very glamorous.
I'm coming to visit.
An airstrip is just a graded piece of paddock, and a hangar is just a shed, really, isn't it? We also keep the cars in the hangar. So that is a good story, actually. When I first met my husband, he's 8 years younger than me, and he was in his early 20s, and he asked me to marry him. And I thought, he's a bit young to be asking me to marry him. I just wondered if he'd really thought it through. And I said, where do you want to be in 20 years? And he said, flying for Qantas, flying the jumbo for Qantas, married with a wife and a few kids, living on a small farm with a strip and a hangar and a little aeroplane. And I went, oh, okay. So,
all right.
So after about 6 years paying off our first house, I said to him, I think it's probably time we went and looked for that little farm, because he was getting bored. Just, there's only so many times you can paint the house or fix it up or mow the lawns or whatever. So we were very lucky to find this piece of land. It actually belonged to the man that lived over the road from us in our little rural village up the road. And he was getting on, and so we wrote him a letter and said, would you like to sell the farm? It actually belonged to he was born here, and so it was a big thing for him to sell it. But it's such a beautiful spot because we've got Hanging Rock just there and Mount Macedon just there. And what we realised was that it's never actually been sold on the open market. It's always just been handed from one person to the next. And I said to him, why did you sell it to us? And he said, oh, I just liked you.
Oh, wow.
I
Well,
just like it.
that's gorgeous. That is a good
Yeah,
story. And so
yeah. So
do you guys fly off the strip there?
well, not at the moment because we've just traded the Cub for a 180, and so the 180's in pieces. But normally we do, yeah. We haven't quite got to the point where we can just jump in and go for a fly because we had the Cub, which had 2 seats, but we're a family of 4. So it would be one of us going for a fly,
Yeah.
usually taking a friend or something. And now we've got the 180, but it should be going by the end of the year, we hope. We're really looking forward to being able to just hop in and fly off. Yeah.
And do you have airspace right around you, or you just take off, you do a call and take off? What does it look like there?
We actually butt up quite close to the Melbourne control zone because Tullamarine, Melbourne's main airport, is 45 minutes drive, and the control steps are above the mountain. So we just take off and keep down low and head north. Yeah.
Sounds like a dream. I'm coming to visit. I can't wait. I can't wait to do that.
I actually miss.
I would like to have a chart with no rings on it to fly in somewhere.
Yeah. I actually
After
miss flying where I learnt to fly, my hometown, which is about 3 hours drive north. And that's a real country town. And there was no airspace there. By the time the jets get to you there, you're there at 35,000 feet. Whereas here we see them come over the mountain, so you can almost read the tail from where we are. And it's been quiet though during COVID. We've really noticed how quiet the skies are.
Yeah, same it is here too. Yeah.
Quite spooky at first.
So what brought you, I know you tell us a little bit in the book, but tell me more about how you came to write this book and why.
I became a writer when I was 45. I had always wanted to do it, and I had my last baby at 43, and I just felt like if I didn't do this now, I probably wouldn't do it, and I was a bit fearful of the next 20 years just slipping by. And so I went off to uni and did a diploma of professional writing and editing, and people would joke, "You've got to write a book about your life," and I said, I felt I didn't have anything to put in the book. And a friend who was a journalist said to me at one point, "So have you started writing?" And I said, "I have actually." And I'd seen a story online about a woman who just had a miscarriage in the public toilet in a hospital in Sydney. And I felt so compelled to reply to that story because I'd had 9 pregnancies by then, 11 pregnancies and 3 children at that point. And so I wrote a story in response to this newspaper article, I think just venting my own emotions, really. And then I put that aside and went on with the course and started writing aviation stories. And how did I come to write a book? One night my husband was away and I was left home with 3 kids and I had the flu. And I sat up in bed with my laptop and wrote a story called The Life and Strife of the Pilot's Wife. And it starts off, how do I get to be the one that stays home with the kids when I'm the one that's sick? And I sent it off to all these friends who said, "Oh my God." One girl said, "I've got tears streaming down my face. That is so funny." And she said, "You must write a book." So I started compiling stories from pilots' wives, other women. And it was just stories about how you have to pack and move all the time and the things that happen when your partner's away, like the hot water blows up or kids with broken arms, or everything happens, when you're home alone. And that morphed into a different version of itself, which was I started doing historical pilots' wives. And I thought about our first real aviator, I guess, was Lawrence Hargrave, who in the late 1800s, he designed the concave wing. And the Wright brothers used that technology, that design, to get, to advance their learnings. And Hargraves was an inventor, and he had steam engines and flying machines and box kites. And I just thought, what's it like being married to that guy? And as I read about him, he was investigating, one of his investigations was the trochoidal theory of serpentine propulsion, which is trying to figure out how a snake moves, how the snake propels. And he strapped a diamond to the snake's belly and put it on glass, and it cut a pattern in the glass. And so I had so much fun theorizing on who held the snake and who held the sticky tape, and where'd that diamond come from, and like, what was it? Was his basement lined with snakes, or what was it like being married to him? And then I just picked one from each decade and went through, and I really enjoyed researching these women. The lady who took it to acquisition said, I love the book and I love your style, but it's just not the right time with this company. So she said, maybe look at a different angle, So I said, oh, well, I'll try women pilots. I was worried that we should be past classifying pilots as being women. But then I went to a conference in 2016, and I heard story number 3 talking at the conference, Pat Toole, about her time in New Guinea. And I just thought that story has to be told. And it was like she'd just handed me the story. She was 88. She told me the story, and then she passed away 2 weeks later. And so I was left with this amazing story. And so I went, right, that's it. I'm writing the book. So I did it.
But you didn't just write a book about Pat Toole.
No.
You wrote a book about 10 women. How did you come to that conclusion? How did you pick 10?
I actually wrote about 9, and then the publisher said, could you do another one, because 9 sounds like you can't find 10. So so I went back to the same process as the Pilot's Wives, which was just starting with using a timeline. And so I started with Nancy Bird, because she started the Women Pilots Association in Australia, and she's very much loved and well respected. And the new Sydney airport, the 3rd Sydney airport, is going to be named after her, the Nancy Bird Walton International Airport. And that opens in about 3 years, 5 years. So I just felt that people, we in the industry, we assume that everybody knows these people, but actually they don't. And so there's quite a renewed interest among the young ones to learn about the old ones and why we care about them.
Yeah,
so,
that's lovely.
Yeah.
And then the next story was about a woman who went off to fly during World War II, which I loved to see it from that perspective, because, we've been talking about the Air Transport Auxiliary from the U.S. women that went over there and flew, and then obviously the British women. But it was really neat to hear that story. How did you come upon that one?
Google. Everything starts with Google. I thought, well, that was the 30s. What happened in the 40s? Oh, World War II. And I thought, I wonder if we had any pilots there. And I chatted to a friend who does a lot of history, aviation history, and he said Australian women were grounded during the war. All the fuel was saved for the war effort, and it was only men who were flying in the war. And so I thought, oh, okay, that's a shame. From my point of view, that's a shame. And so I just started Googling, and I came across this story of Marty Gething, who married an English Air Force pilot and was living in London during the war. They went to Toronto first, where they were married, and then he was training navigators there, I think. And then they went back to England halfway during the war, and he went off on posting overseas, and she stayed in England and flew for the Air Transport Auxiliary for 2 years. And I think she flew 27 different types of aircraft. And that's a hell of a thing, as anyone who flies knows, to jump in an aeroplane with very minimal training. And they had a blue folder that was about that big, with big rings on it. And each page had the basic handling, takeoff, stall speed,
everything you needed to know about that plane on one page. And then if you got into another page, you just flip to page 4.
Yeah,
you're good to go.
Page 227. The thing was about that thick, it was a really thick folder. And I've seen one. My friend's got a reproduction one, and it's very small writing. It looks like in a dictionary. You know how dictionaries have really small writing. And I thought, imagine being 23 or 24 and you got this thing and you got to get in that thing and use this thing to figure it out. They did do training, like basic, they were divided into 6 types, like light bombers, medium bombers, heavy bombers. So you go and learn, do training on the light bomber, but you'd only learn on that one airplane, and then there might be 6, 10 aircraft in that category. So it's like learning to fly a Cessna, but then getting in a Archer, you know, and then a whatever. You do a tailwheel endorsement and you're in a Piper Cub, and then you're in a whatever, something much bigger, a Beach maybe.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I mean, the only people that I know who have that kind of flexibility, you know, obviously, if you're a civilian paying for flying and training, you're probably, unless you just are loaded and have nothing else to do, and you're not going to fly that variety of aircraft. But our test pilots, you know, our test pilots get to go to that kind of training where they get to fly multiple aircraft. And then I've heard them talk about how that becomes easier the more that you do it. But, you know, it's a big deal to transition from one aircraft and learn. I mean, it's a big deal to get into a rental car and figure out where the brake is and everything, you know, like where is everything? So yeah, I can only imagine how challenging that was, but it's really cool that she did it.
I did make that analogy where if you can imagine getting from a Ford truck into a Porsche, and then where are the lights and where are the indicators and how do you work the radio, and well, the brakes are touchy, you know, but to figure that out at 300 miles an hour, you know, is a different thing.
Exactly. I know.
Yeah. She only had 200 hours when she joined the ATA.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah. It was also the first time the women got equal pay. So they were, the women made up about, I think, 10 to 20% of the ATA. And at some point, somebody lobbied and the women's pay was brought up to be equal with the men.
Yeah, so Elizabeth Ween also spoke about that. They're very proud of the fact that they were paying their women appropriately. Unlike in the United States, what was happening at the time, for sure.
Yeah, we've come a long way.
We can have a whole discussion about that. How far have we come? Well, how far have we come? Let's talk about some more of the women. Who do you want to talk about next?
I think because this is mainly a US audience, I might read a part from story number 9, which is Nicole Forrester, and she's still flying now. She's with the Australian Air Force. She's just got her command on the Airbus, but she started off, you know, everybody has that first job. First job's the hardest to get. She went to university and did her flying training there. And so, of course, you come out with just a very basic license and minimal experience. And so rather than chase an airline job straight away, Nicole decided to go to the outback and really cut her teeth, you know, really learning how to fly that plane, you know. So she was in a little 152 out on probably one of the largest cattle stations in Australia. And so I'll read this part about her flying into the cattle station. She had grown up in the city in Brisbane, and she'd travelled internationally, but she'd never travelled to the outback. And she says how it was just like going to a different country, because the accents were different. Out in the outback, they speak, they kind of round their words a lot more. And
can you do it? Can you do the accent for me?
I wouldn't dare to try. But what would an American equivalent might be Texas, you know, where it's kind of slower but different. Yeah. So this is Nicole flying out into figuring out what she's getting into. On the stations, cattle stations, because minimal height over land here is 500 feet, but on the stations, they've actually got clearance to fly down to ground level, because they do mustering and they go down to check bores, the water bores, and check the fencing. So it would take days to drive around. So they go around, spend a whole day doing it in the airplane.
And when you just used the word mustering, that we would call herding.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Herding the livestock, mustering, yeah.
Yeah. So they've just flown over the boundary onto the station. So, and she had a map, so she's all prepared. She's got her map, and she's marked a dam, a big. Do you use the word dam? Water hole.
Yeah.
So the other pilot began pointing out things Nicole would need to know, and she tried to follow their progress on her new flying maps. But on the treeless earth that splayed out around them, as flat and as green as a football field, there was neither hill nor hole to navigate by. The earth was as big as the sky, and the station's large dam that she'd marked as a good navigation point prior to departure turned out to be 160 kilometres west of where they were heading. In all her time there, she never saw the dam. Boggled by the size of the property and its vast boundaries, she scanned the horizon, which was as straight as a string line, until eventually the settlement appeared. The pilot dialed up the correct radio frequency and did a pass over the homestead to announce their arrival, and then circled to land on the station's, so station is like a ranch. That's the term we use, on the ranch's wide red dirt runway. She disembarked into the stifling midday sun and helped the admin lady load the lorry. The inevitable first question was whether Nicole had a protective hat to wear. She took a deep breath. Yep, she said, I've got a hat, because she felt ridiculous in this hat, the cowboy hat, because she was action girl, and she was always wearing a peaked cap. And I've got a hat. And she gingerly placed the thing on her head. She felt ridiculous. When Nicole got out to shake the boss's hand, he pointed to her head and said, I'll bash that for you later. She reeled and thought, okay, what was that all about? She said, I was already confounded and began to wonder why I'd done this to myself. What was I doing out here in the middle of nowhere? I assumed I'd be living with the Gillaroos in a dorm block, but the head stockman was actually a woman. She was my age and she wanted a housemate, so I was unbelievably lucky to get a room in her house. The other workers told me that as a lowly pilot, it was most unusual. I was very impressed that there was a woman in a management role. The settlement was set around a lightly treed, well-watered lawn that defied stark surroundings. From the wraparound veranda of the large manager's house, the boss could keep an eye on the other few houses, kitchen, the butcher's shop, office, storerooms, clinic, and Jackaroo and Gillaroo quarters. That's, what do you call them? Cowboys. Yeah. The
hands, yeah.
Jackaroo and Gillaroo quarters that housed everybody down to the most junior of the station's 50 workers. The nearest neighbours, and for that matter, everybody in Nicole's address book, lived somewhere to the east, beyond the curvature of the earth. The moment of truth came after crossing the timber floors, when she heaved her suitcase onto her single bed and stared blankly at her new shirts. One of them had to come out. She couldn't get her head around the clothes. Within a couple of hours, she was wearing it down at the stock camp, gagging at the sights, sounds, and sensations of sweat, poo, blood, and bull dust that surrounded her. As the heat and dust crusted her sweaty face, she shifted in her crisp clothing and peered out from under her stiff new hat, wondering how this would all pan out. Her new colleague and housemate looked back worriedly at her and wondered the same thing. Poor Nicole. So I have to, what was the thing we had to explain? Oh, the bash. I'll bash that for you later.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
So I do explain that later in the story, where the one day she went to say something. She went to the manager's office and went to tell him something, and he said, oh, come in. And he turned the kettle on. And he held the hat over the steam, over the kettle, and he rolled it, because it softened the felt, and he rolled it and molded it and just sort of fixed it up. And they put a point in the front, and he handed it back to her. He goes, there you go. And bashing in the hat means steaming it and molding it and rolling it. Yeah. So she figured out what that meant, but it was a bit confronting when she first heard it. Yeah.
So I remember this story. So she's out of college. She goes out into this crazy like farm world. And is flying for them. She also has to do like ranch hand duties in addition to the flying. She builds some hours there, and then she is introduced to some military women and decides to sign up, which I thought was really cool.
our Women Pilots Association has about 15 or 20 scholarships annually that we give out. And Nicole got the aerobatic scholarship, which is sponsored by the Air Force. And so she had to go back and knock on the door and ask the boss if she could go to this conference, which came at the most busy time on the station. So she knew it was a big ask. But his wife was so excited. She said, of course you must go. So I'm sure they had some words after she left. But she went to the conference and she was awarded the RAF scholarship, and she met lots of other women who were flying for the Air Force, and one of them got up and gave a talk about what it takes to become an Air Force pilot, and she listed some of the qualities that were, desirable. And Nicole said, I sat there mentally ticking them all off and thought, maybe I could do this. And she said, the girls I met were great, and they just weren't what she expected of the military. And so she got in. Yeah, she loves it.
I love that story. I think that's super cool.
Yeah.
And it says a lot about the value of having organizations like that. Australian Women Pilots Association, where you have conferences and people come together and you get in a room with the other possibilities. Does the Australian, I don't know whether all of these international associations or that's a national association, if they have like sisterships with other countries' associations.
So there is a British Women Pilots Association, and we would affiliate with the 99s in the US. Okay. So some of our members are members of the 99s as well. I think there's a New Zealand one as well. I'm not sure. Yeah. So it's a great thing. I think I really underestimated the value of it until I went to that first conference, and I just came home on such a high. And actually, I'm going on Monday again to Broken Hill.
Oh, good.
So I'm going this year. Yeah.
How often do they happen?
Every year. We didn't have it last year because of COVID. Yeah. So around April. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm interviewing Georgia, the girl on the cover. She's the ag pilot. And
that was another great story.
So I convinced her that she should be a guest speaker. And so she's a bit nervous about speaking. She said, I don't do public speaking. She said, I just fly the plane. So I'm going to do a panel with her, do an interview with her.
Oh, that's perfect. That'll be great.
Yeah.
So whose story surprised you the most? Or what surprised you the most as you were doing your research for this book?
I think Deborah Laurie was the first Australian woman to fly for a major airline, and that was in the 70s. I think she started in 1979. And it seems unbelievable that the boss of the guy who owned that airline said outright, I will never employ, no woman will ever step foot in a cockpit of my aeroplane. So she had a very determined opponent. And I knew her story, but when I started researching it and going through court documents, and I think I was surprised at how dirty the fight got and how determined he was that she wouldn't get a job. Yeah.
It's excruciating to read what she went through. And I don't know. I mean, how many people would have the intestinal fortitude to continue that fight? I mean, all she wanted to do was fly. She could fly, but she fought the good fight and paved the way for the other women.
It went on for almost 12 months, the court case, and from first going in to see the Equal Opportunity Board. So she was lucky because the Equal Opportunity Board had just been set up in Victoria, and the Sex Discrimination Act had just come into being. And so Deborah's was the test case for that act. And afterwards they said, if we hadn't won this, we can't imagine a case that we could win because the discrimination was so clear cut. But her life changed dramatically because she was a flying instructor doing circuits at Moorabbin, and people said to her, just be content with doing that. And yet when you look at her career now, she did 10 years with that airline, and then we had a big pilots dispute in 1989. A lot of people lost their job, and she ended up in Holland. And she had a very successful career in Holland. She became an air safety expert. She had 15 years flying around Europe. And then she's been back in Australia for about 10 years, I think. And so she's, had a very long and fulfilling career that was very different to flying circuits at Moorabbin.
Yeah,
So,
no, I mean, totally worth the struggle, but it was just a painful struggle to
yeah,
even read about, much less live.
yeah.
Somebody in one of the women's Facebook groups the other day posted a picture from a friend's mother. It was a rejection letter that she had received in 1980 from an airline saying that unfortunately we wouldn't be able to hire you because of the potential for you to leave the company to have children. And you should have seen the uproar on the Facebook, like, the response to, oh, that's not real. That doesn't, check the dates, check the company, that didn't happen. And I was like, no, hold on, people. Hold on. I've got a book for you to read.
Was it 1980? Did you say?
Yeah, it was 1980. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's when Deborah, yeah.
Yeah.
She said that at around that time, the American airlines had a little bit of a conference to figure out, how's this thing going with these women pilots? Let's get together and nut out the problems. And she said it was a very quick meeting because there was no problems and everyone just went back to work. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that line. I love that. Well, so I don't want to miss out on any, like we've talked about, this really should be 10 calls so that we could talk about each story individually and give it the attention it deserves. I want to hear, you said you might have one more reading for me. But before you do it, I just want to say that throughout the book, one of the things that was clearly evident is that this was not only being written by a pilot who was able to kind of convey the physical movement and feeling and enough technical information so that we sort of knew what was happening relative to the space around that person, both inside the cockpit and around the aircraft, which I thought was really well done. But it was definitely written by a very skilled writer, and especially your descriptions of the terrain and just the different parts of the country there. I felt like you really captured those really well. As someone who hasn't been to Australia, I felt like I was there. I haven't been to New Guinea. I definitely felt like I was there. So I just wanted to say thank you for pulling both your aviation talent and your writing talent together to preserve. I mean, these stories are incredibly important for people to know, and you've preserved them in such a beautiful way for posterity. I think it's lovely. So I would love to hear one more reading.
So I think I should read about Patricia Toole, seeing as you've mentioned New Guinea.
Yes, please.
Patricia Toole so when I went to that first Women Pilots Conference in 2016, Pat was the guest speaker one night, not the main speaker, but it was on the Thursday night, I think. The conference goes Wednesday to Saturday night. And she got up to speak. And so what we saw was this elderly woman sort of shuffling up onto the stage. And I don't know what I expected. I think I was only half listening, actually, at the time. I was busy chatting or doing whatever I was doing. And I didn't know her. I hadn't heard of her. And I was very new to this space. And I was right up the back of the room. But she started speaking and everybody politely listened. But she got the audience in immediately. There was no long preamble. And she told, the first thing she said was the first story about arriving in New Guinea, which was at that time a protectorate of Australia. So it was governed, managed by the Australian government. And there was lots of Australian expats up there putting in infrastructure and running the country, basically. And so she arrived at Port Moresby Airport. Her boss was a World War II fighter ace, and he'd set up this airline, and a small airline just flying freight and supplies into these very hard to get at areas. So I haven't actually been to New Guinea, but it's probably a bit like Brazil, where it's the landscape and the tropics. And so she rocked up at the airport, and her boss was going to surprise the team with this female pilot, because that's how unusual it was to have a woman pilot. So she was the first woman to fly in New Guinea. It was 1952, and she arrived at Port Moresby, but he'd forgotten that she was coming. And so she arrived to an empty welcome. And I thought, oh, that's a bit mean, you know. And she said on day 3, they got her into the Lodestar, which was, she was meant to be the first officer. And so she was going to have a long apprenticeship as first officer on this Lodestar, which would carry 10 or 15 people. They took off in the Lodestar, and they'd hardly even left the circuit area, but they were meant to go past a volcano which was still smouldering after its recent eruption. And I wrote in the book, unfortunately, the Lodestar was also smouldering, as on departure, air traffic control called them back and said, your portside engine's on fire. And so they had to come back to this. And we've just gone, oh, that's a good story. And then she said 10 days later, she was told, we're going to go up to Wewak, which from Port Moresby, you go up over the New Guinea highlands, which are up very high mountains, 15,000 feet, some of them, and then down to Wewak on the northern coast. And she arrived in Wewak. They got sent off on a charter that same day, and they had an engine failure and had to land on a mountaintop. And it took them 10 minutes to fly out and 10 hours to walk back. And so, you know, by then I was really listening, thinking, oh, this is quite a story. And that went on for about half an hour, those stories that she told us. And so I put down my drink and picked up my camera and walked up to the front of the room and sat at the table right in front of her. And I just couldn't, you know, we all had tears in our eyes. By the end of it, she got a standing ovation. It was just like, that was a hell of a story. So I'm going to read you a piece where she was doing a freight run. This was towards the end of her time. She'd gone from Wewak along the coast to Wanamo, and then back to Taji, and then she goes up into the mountains and to a hilltop town called Lumi, where she was meant to drop off some freight for a missionary. And as she got up, she could see Lumi, and suddenly the cloud came up out of the jungle, and she said it was rising faster than I could climb, and then she was swamped by it. And so she had to turn east, and she tried to get back to an airport out of the mountains down by the river, hoping that the cloud would break up, but it didn't. And eventually she just found one hole in the cloud, and through the hole she saw a riverbed, and she thought, that'll do. She was out of options. She thought she wasn't going to get home that night. So she spiraled down through the hole and landed on this riverbed. And she spent the night out there being eaten by mosquitoes, and in the back of a little Oster aeroplane. So it's just a little 4-seat aeroplane with not much to eat. So I will just read you the bit where she's just landed. In a time-critical move, she stamped hard on one brake and flung the Oster around in a sweeping ground loop. As she slewed around, a boulder violently snapped off the right undercarriage leg and also took care of the starboard wingtip and the propeller tip. The sturdy little aeroplane ground to a shuddering nose-down halt against the bank, with its checkered tail pointing at the clouds. Unbelievably, its pilot had survived, but she was quickly out and gone, fearing a fire. Pat ran down to the water's edge, where her shaking hand instinctively reached into her pocket for a smoke. How on earth had she survived this ordeal when so many before her hadn't? She lit up a cigarette and took stock of her situation. It was only 10:30 a.m. on a Monday. She was alone with just 2 cigarettes, 2 bags of salt, 2 bolts of fabric, a tin of condensed milk, a packet of barley sugar, 4 litres of fuel, so a gallon of fuel, and no communications. Oil on the windscreen confirmed that during the whiteout she'd been inverted. So that's quite a moment, isn't it, for you to realise that you're stranded on a riverbank in the jungle. So she was out there for a night, and the next day they found her, which was amazing, because an aeroplane can easily be swallowed up by the jungle, you know, if it had gone down under the trees. But because she was on this wide riverbank, somebody spotted her, which was really just a fluke, I think, really. So they came back and they dropped her. She'd been told by the United Nations that she was not to fly over certain parts of the country because she was a woman, and they feared that there were some hostile tribes living down there, and that if she came down, she could be in a lot of trouble. But she said, well, you know, the men fly over it, what's the difference? So they agreed that she could fly by herself, but she'd have to carry a gun. So I'm not sure what the gun would. Anyway, maybe she could hunt some food.
Right.
Of all the items she would have lamented not having for that trip, a radio. So they used to fly without radios because they were unreliable around the mountains, and also they were heavy, and so they took up, they could use that weight to carry more freight. Of all the items she would have lamented not having for that trip, a radio, survival rations, even some insect repellent, she'd forgotten the most important was the Department of Civil Aviation's gun. She dived into the survival kit, because they found her and dropped her this survival kit, and pulled out a strange pistol and ammunition. Turning it in her hands, she eyed the cold, hard Luger and thought she'd better learn how to load it and fire it. Her shot rang out unheard by anyone else. Next in the pack was more fresh water, and then out came some old wartime K rations. These were 3 meals in a tin, wrapped in a heavy wax, grease-proof paper. The horrible wax paper smell had permeated the lot, rendering even the tin camped pie inedible. The last thing, so she had no food except the barley sugar, the lollies. The very last thing she found was a New Guinea expat staple, a bottle of rum negrita, wrapped in a towel and included to numb pain in case of injury. She thought with a grin, now you're talking. It was hardly top shelf, but what the hell. No sooner had Pat started smiling at the rum than the smile was wiped right off her face. She froze as she looked up the river bend, and movement slowly morphed into the shapes of men. She quietly picked up the Luger and put it in her pocket and watched, trembling, as the group advanced. Not 2, not 10, not 20. She's not sure how many there were, but it felt like 100 or 200 naked men armed with spears, axes, and bows and arrows approaching her. As she awaited her fate, they came close enough for Pat to see the whites of their teeth, because, thank God, the front ones were smiling. So they were friendly. They invited her back to the village, and she said, no, I think I should stay with the aeroplane. And she would have been a bit nervous going back to sleep in the village huts. So a couple of them stayed with her to help her in case the river came up overnight with all the rain. So Pat returned to the aeroplane, and with a nip of neat rum, kept a nervous eye on the rising river, which was rapidly rising with each inch of rain. A dedicated young government patrol officer walked into the small village later that evening looking for the crashed aeroplane. Just as Pat had received the water and the rations from the sky, the search party in the Dragon had flown on and dropped a rudimentary map with a circle that said, proceed to the scene of the crash. The circle covered about 300 square kilometres of forbidding jungle. With this scant information, the patrol officer made an educated guess and set out at about lunchtime from his post. The villagers informed him that the pilot was female and some miles down the ever-expanding river. The officer, a stocky Australian who'd been partly raised in New Guinea, was used to walking for days on patrol in this country, and without hesitation continued overland into the night with his 3 local police assistants. They hacked their way down the last few kilometres of steep and slippery jungle around 10 p.m. When he fired a couple of shots into the deep night to signal his approach, Pat replied with a couple of rounds from the Luger, but her shots echoed from the steep canyon walls unheard. Through teeming rain, she stared into the blackness and waited. Eventually, a hurricane lantern lit the very welcome face of the 21-year-old patrol officer, Jock McGregor. They introduced themselves, and then Pat, turning to her new friend, inquired, Jock, would you like a rum? Christ, exclaimed her sandy-haired saviour. I walk for 8 hours in the jungle. I find a woman alive and she offers me rum. You bloody beaut. The police assistants erected a grass shelter as Pat and Jock crouched under the Oster wing. Precious rum splashed into a couple of tin mugs, 5 glugs each. And as Jock rested his feet, Pat handled the drinks and began her debrief. Oblivious to the mosquitoes and the river rocks, they finished the bottle and fell into a relieved sleep around 3 a.m. Pat had been out there for more than 40 hours. Yeah, so you can imagine hearing that story, not knowing what's coming, in a room full of about 100 women pilots. And it was a really emotional, gripping adventure that she took us on. And, you know, that's just part of it. So, but that's the part I loved. When she said, Jock, would you like a rum? And I just went, it was like a light went on, and I thought, I have to tell that story. That's a movie.
Well, I feel that way. You know, cinematic is definitely a great way to describe the whole book. But I feel like that story for me came through probably the most clear of all of them, and probably because of your emotional reaction to hearing her talk about it. And I wish we could talk about all of them. I do want to say that Lynn Gray's story, you know, is also, they're all gripping, but that one is terrifying, you know, being someone who spent a lot of her career over the ocean and spent plenty of time imagining what it might be like to be out there for an extended period of time if I survived a crash. But it was really neat because I Googled the C-130 crew because I was like, I was the pilot's assignment officer at the time. Let me see if I recognize. And I recognized, I wasn't good friends with them or anything, but I totally knew who the aircraft commander was, the one who had been on both of those rescues. And it was just neat because, you know, in the Coast Guard, our poor C-130 pilots don't get as much glory as the helicopter pilots do, who are like down, you know, plucking people out of the water. But obviously their services are definitely needed.
Well, she talked about how they circled her. They went around them for 2 hours just to check on them and just to be there with them. She said it was like an angel, just circling. I don't know if they went around like that or around that way, but yeah. And her co-pilot, Christian, he also said it was just wonderful to have those American Coast Guard guys there circling. I wonder if they can get a copy of the book. We'll track them down.
I'll dig up. I definitely know how to find the aircraft commander, and he probably knows where to find the co-pilot. He's not in the aircraft commander isn't flying for the Coast Guard anymore, but I think he's still flying for civilians. So that would be neat.
I wish I'd known that when I was writing the story.
Yeah, you could have talked with them.
Because I got so many different points of view for that one. I really wanted to make it as well-rounded as possible. Yeah, it would have been great.
You did. Even just having that comment from the cockpit, you know, and I'm the bloke that picked you up or came out here last time for you. It's like, oh my gosh. And then the last thing I wanted to say was, for anybody who's listening who hasn't joined in any book club discussions yet, I will just say that we've had several instances during our book club discussions where the authors pop on, and it was really special that you popped on our first one this month, and that you brought Esther with you, the subject of the last story. So not only did we have the author, but we had one of the pilots that you were talking about in the book on the call. It was so cool to talk, you know, to compare notes on the kind of flying that she was doing.
Flying doctors.
Yeah, she was flying the doctors and doing the rescue of, like, you know, people who were torn up, and actually having her hands on the victims, which I would never do. Yeah, I was just flying the plane. So it was really.
He had that very powerful image of the guy who'd been burnt, and she said, I said to her, "What's the one story that stays with you?" And she said it would be that man who was burnt. And she said, I just remember seeing him walking out of the dark in just his underpants, and every few steps he'd stop and throw up. And then they put him in the aeroplane and wrapped him up in plastic. In Glad wrap, which is what cling film, I don't know what you guys call it, but it's what we put on our sandwiches. And she said it's your best friend because it stops the infection getting in.
Yeah.
And also she had that great story where the guy who'd been gored by the bull, and he said, "Where's the pilot? Who's the pilot?" And she's this little blonde Dutch woman, and she said, "I'm the pilot." And he said, you're too little. You're too little. I'm not flying with a woman." And she said when they gave him the drugs, and by the time he got to Adelaide, he wanted to marry her. Yeah.
That's really great too, because there's been a lot of chatter with all the women in aviation about stupid things people say to you. I just wrote a little short story about something like that also. So it's just funny, like, "Oh, I'm not gonna fly with you." Well, then you're gonna be out here on your own, buddy. So yeah, we don't need choice.
Yeah.
Well, so before, I just want to say thank you for this. We're going to transition into talking about a little bit more about writing, but I wanted to say thank you so much for the book. Thank you so much for taking the time to do the interview with me, and also for popping on to the book club discussion. That was wonderful.
That's fantastic that you've taken such an interest, Liz, and to have these Australian women go to the US for the US audiences to just be able to meet them and to know that we're out here doing it too. Flying a lot of American airplanes, and there's lots of American references or experiences, with Gabby Kennard, who flew around the world following Amelia Earhart's route. There's Georgia on the cover flying the air tractor. There was Nancy Bird, who flew in the Powder Puff Derby. There's Marty Gething, who went to Toronto, when she got married during the war, and travelled through the US as a young girl. And yeah, so I think it's relevant in that way as well as just the general global flying experiences that anyone who flies understands, as you've obviously connected with. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's
Absolutely.
great. Because in the beginning you think, well, I'll write this book and hopefully someone will read it. But,
Absolutely. I think everyone should read this. Every pilot should read this. Man, woman, want to be a pilot, interested in aviation. If you're an aviation geek, check it out. It's just chock full of fabulous stories.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thanks so much for listening. Please join us in the Aviatrix Book Club and on the Aviatrix Book Review podcast next month, when we'll discuss The Women Who Flew for Hitler by Claire Mully. Blue skies, everyone.
And he